Hi, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon, and I wish that I could be with you physically this week. I might have already been with some of you virtually by the time you see this video, but I'm grateful for the opportunity. I've had lots of connections to Eastern and Palmer Theological Seminary. In fact, a couple of the people that work on my team are graduates of the seminary at Palmer, and I know many of you are undergrad students, and I thought during this lunch hour I would talk a bit about God's call on my life, specifically a call towards justice, but also a call towards global missions, and what that means as a woman, an evangelical woman, what that means in a world where often missions have been used to marginalize others or to exercise white privilege and supremacy in colonial ways. And so a missions journey that is authentic to the heart of God. The Bible verse that I've been praying over as I've been thinking about our time together is the verse from the book of Acts that says, I have called you to be my witnesses from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the ends of the earth. And so I did put together a little bit of a presentation and some pictures. I thought that would be more interesting than just, looking at me talking to you on a screen during the next minutes we have together. And so may God go before us. My hope and prayer is that each of us would be obedient to God's call on our life, wherever that may be. If it's responding to the needs of our own backyard, or if it's responding to needs and injustices that we see around the world. So I'm going to share my screen and hope that you can see this PowerPoint presentation. The title of it is Justice Journey, a Pilgrimage to the Holy Land through Israel and the Occupied Palestinian Territories. I thought for a long time that God was calling me to missions. I actually thought he was calling me to be a medical missionary in China. I speak fluent Chinese. I now work in the Middle East. There's not a lot of Chinese speakers in the Arab world, interestingly enough. But before all of that, my journey really began at Willow Creek Community Church. That was my first ministry position. I went to a seminary where I came to believe that women are called and equipped to use all of their gifts for the glory of God, even preaching and teaching and being pastors in the context of the church. So I was on my way to being ordained, and I was hired at Willow Creek to lead these journeys called Justice Journeys. And many of you might recognize the man in the middle of this picture, John Perkins, a leader from the civil rights movement from Mississippi, a mentor in my life, and his teaching over me and his mentoring in large part shaped my view of the world. That's my mother there with us, and this is standing outside a bar in Memphis on one of our justice journeys, one of the first ones that we did with Willow Creek. And the types of things that we did was travel to sites that were significant in the civil rights movement. Many of these have become increasingly well known by the next generations because of movies like Selma, which you might have seen. And the bridge there that you see is the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And on our journeys, we based them on this idea that comes from a concept out of Africa, and the word is Sankofa. And Sankofa means looking at the past in order to move forward and heal and pursue justice and work towards a different reality in the future. And so the goals of our journeys weren't just to learn the history, but to learn the history so that we could be advocates of justice moving forward. And in the picture you can see on the bottom of the screen there, we traveled with white leaders from Willow Creek, with African-American leaders from Salem Baptist Church on the south side of Chicago. And we sought to do this racial justice pilgrimage so that we would learn what it means to be advocates of justice. Coming out of that experience, I left Willow and I had all of these experiences and passions in my heart. And I felt really inspired to write about it. And so I had asked the question, when I was beginning in ministry, I wish that someone had just, told me the things that I needed to know. Basic history of social justice in the church, basic questions about how does the Bible intersect with politics? What are global justice issues? And so I ended up writing this book. Forgive me for the title. I don't presume to think that I could write the social justice handbook by any means, but this book was birthed out of those early ministry experiences. It was my first book. It was published in 2009. You can see that John Perkins wrote the foreword to it, Social Justice Handbook. But here's what I love about the title, Small Steps for a Better World. And in that, I believe that God calls each of us in our own context, in our own environment, that God calls each of us to be faithful to making a difference in the world. And sometimes we'll take as many steps back as steps forward, but that our purpose is to be faithful, and that God is the one who will, make the seeds that we plant grow. From that, at the same time, I was out in California. I had this book coming out. I was doing a doctorate. I thought my PhD would be in the history of the church's engagement in the civil rights movement. I studied under one of the foremost scholars of Black American history, Clarence Walker, who was another incredible mentor to me during those years of my doctoral studies. But this is one of the things I hope we take out of our conversation together, is that often the plans that we have for ourselves are not the plans that God has for ourselves, or for us. And what I mean in that regard is that at every point in my life, I thought I was going to do medical missions in China, and then I was called to the Middle East. I thought I was going to do a PhD on domestic civil engagement and the role of the church. And then God had other plans. And I went on this spiritual pilgrimage to the Holy Land. You might recognize the picture that's on the screen, Haram el-Sharif, or the Temple Mount, or the Dome of the Rock, the third most sacred site in Islam, that sits on what would have been the ancient temple, that sits on what would have been Mount Moriah, where Abraham was called to sacrifice Isaac, in the sacred city of Jerusalem. So I went on this spiritual pilgrimage, and God just put a new call on my life. I was brokenhearted about many of the realities that I saw there, but I was also moved by the verses in the scriptures that talk about how if the people during Jesus's triumphal entry had not cried out to worship him, the very stones would cry out. And I felt like the city of Jerusalem was sacred in that regard, that the space was sacred, but then even more so, the people. And so I had these experiences of sacredness, but then some of the geopolitical realities, like you can see here, of a separation barrier and realities between the two primary people that live in the land, Jews, Muslims, and Christians, but the Jewish community and the Arab community. And so I started to have these provocations in my spirit that yes, the land was sacred, but that something else was going on in the current reality. The city of Jerusalem, of course, is significant to us in our Christian faith. It is the sacred and most holy city for the Jewish people globally, and certainly the Jewish people of Israel. But then when you see people worship at the Western Wall, and then there's guns everywhere, that some of these juxtapositions I really honestly didn't understand. And what's interesting is I had several master's degrees. I was getting my PhD. It wasn't like I wasn't educated, and yet there was this conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, of which I'd had virtually no exposure. And so I started to see signs like Free Palestine. And honestly, I thought Palestine was a map in the back of the Bible. I didn't know anything about the contemporary movement of the Palestinian state. I didn't know anything about historic Palestine, and we'll talk about all of that in a few minutes. But I just started to have these promptings in my spirit that there was something else going on of which I wasn't aware. And I don't know if any of you recognize this man in this picture here. He's been a very formative figure in my own life from Bethlehem Bible College. On that same tour, I had the opportunity to hear from Bashara Awad, the founder of Bethlehem Bible College. Bashara is a Palestinian. He's a Palestinian Christian, and he's a Palestinian refugee. In 1948, his father was killed during the what was called the War of Independence by the Israelis and what was called the Nakba, or the catastrophe, by the Palestinians. And I heard for the first time from Bashara the story of the Palestinian people. And you can see, if you can tell in my eyes there, I was overcome. This was on that spiritual pilgrimage. And as Bashara told his family narrative and his family story, I wept and my heart was utterly broken. So much so that I went back to Clarence Walker, who I mentioned previously, my dissertation advisor. And even though I was getting my PhD in American history, I said, Clarence, I need to write about what's happening in Israel. And he said, you know that you're getting your PhD in American history. And so I ended up doing my doctoral work and my research on the history of the American Protestant church and the history of American Protestant engagement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So this was quite a turning point for me in my journey. And what I thought we could spend a few minutes talking about today, I'm sure some of you might have studied these in class, but I want to just give you a bit of the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the history that I had such little exposure to, that I knew nothing about. And I will do my best to do so in a way that's not polemic, in a way that represents the multiple Jewish narratives that contribute to this story and the multiple Arab perspectives and Palestinian perspectives as well. One of the things that we really need to understand is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has not been going on for thousands of years. This is a contemporary geopolitical conflict. This is a conflict that's modern. This is a conflict that in large part came out of political challenges in the 19th and 20th century. So in the 19th century, there was a movement called the Jewish Zionist movement, where Jews around the world were experiencing horrific anti-Semitism, pogroms in Russia, anti-Semitism in Europe. And so the Jewish Zionist movement was established so that the Jews could establish or return to their historic homeland in Israel. And there were actually lots of questions about where this should happen or where it might be, specifically after World War II. But the original aims of the Jewish Zionist movement were a return to Israel. At the same time, you had World War I, where the powers in Europe were fighting against the Ottoman Empire. You had the Allied forces in battle. And one of the consequences of World War I is that the Near East, Palestine, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, what you can see in the map there, was essentially at the whim of the powers in terms of World War I. So there were some contradictory promises made, and I won't go through all of the details of those, but one of the most famous is the 1917 Balfour Declaration, where Lord Balfour promised the Jewish people that they would be able to return to their historic homeland, historic Israel. That territory at that time was called Palestine. It was the Ottoman, it was under Ottoman control prior to World War I, and historic Palestine had local, mostly Arab populations. There was a small indigenous Jewish population, but most of the population were Arabs, Arab Bedouins. And so you had this promise from Balfour, but you also had promises that were made to the indigenous Arab population as well, that they would be able to have an independent state after World War I. And for those of you who know what's happening now, in some ways, the very questions that were being asked in 1917 are similar questions that are being asked today. So the Allied powers win World War I. What happens to historic Palestine? It becomes what's called a mandate, or British Mandatory Palestine. So the British start to control the territory from the period of 1917 to 1947. And prior to 1917, prior to that, it's important to understand that in large part, Jews and Arabs lived side by side in peace. That when I talk about this conflict being a modern conflict, there certainly was violence because there were Jews that were immigrating long before World War II, and some of the local population was very resistant to that idea. But in large part, the Jews that had lived in the land of Palestine for thousands of years, the Arab community that lived there, in large part, they lived in peace until this contemporary or modern history of the early 20th century. So you have the British mandate in Palestine, and a few things that were happening were the immigration of a number of Jews coming from around the world, particularly where there was discrimination and anti-Semitism. You had unrest, you had Arab revolts in response to that. You had governments debating what should happen with this territory and conversations in that regard. But you also had a resistance of the increasing Jewish population to the British. So you might have heard of the bombing of the King David Hotel, for example. That was Jewish Zionist forces who were identified as terrorists responding to the presence of Britain and wanting to get them out of the territory so that eventually the state of Israel could be established. So all of that was up until 1947. And in 1947, things hit a point where the British said, we can't take this any longer, we're out. So the British leave and turn the question of Palestine over to what was the just recently formed United Nations. And the United Nations came up with a plan that was called the Partition Plan. The Partition Plan addressed the population. At that point, about 67% of the population were Arabs, and the population of Jews was certainly increasing, but was about 33% at that time. And the Partition Plan of 1947 would have given 67% of the land to a future Jewish state. It's important to acknowledge that a lot of that land wasn't quality land, if you will. It was in the Negev desert. You can see that in the white portion on the map. And the idea was to give 42% to the Arab state. It includes what's now Gaza, a part of that Negev desert. It includes what in large part now is the West Bank, but you can see that 42% was offered to the Arabs. Many of you know this history. The Jews said yes, and the Arabs said no. And so this was what launched the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The war was not just against the Palestinians or the Arabs living in the Palestinian territory. It was a war between the neighboring Arabs, from Egypt, from Jordan, against these Jewish Zionist forces. And that war in 1948, from the Jewish perspective, is called the War of Independence. And from the Palestinian perspective, is called the Nakba, the catastrophe. One of the results of the war, which Israel won, was the establishment of the State of Israel. At this point in 1948, the horrors of the Holocaust are increasingly becoming known. At this point, you have refugees from Europe coming out of World War II. And in large part, the world did not want the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism was still incredibly prevalent. So the world wanted the Jews to return to historic Palestine because they didn't want them in their own backyards. And at the same time, you had the Palestinian people. The Nakba resulted in a refugee population of Palestinians that was 750,000 people. The estimates sometimes say between 750,000 and 1 million, but a significant portion of the Arab community that was living in historic Palestine was displaced. And that is an issue that still exists today. That refugee population now has more than 5 million Palestinian refugees identified by the UN. So 1948 was the first major war. I'm going to go through and, not even talk about some of the major battles, but the next major war was in 1967. In 1967, the big question was the surrounding Arab states did not acknowledge Israel's right to exist. And so Israel received word that the Egyptian Air Force and the armies were getting ready to go to war. Israel launched a preemptive attack against Egypt and against Jordan and Syria, and they won this war in guess how many days? 6 days. 1967, the 6-day war. This was a turning point in terms of the U.S.-Israel relationship. As a result of Israel's victory, Israel took control of the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt, the Golan Heights in Syria. Under the Trump administration, the Golan was actually acknowledged to be annexed. There had been no previous U.S. administration that had acknowledged Israel's control of the Golan. And then the West Bank and Gaza also came under Israeli control. This year is significant in the history because when we talk about the occupation, when we talk about the military control of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, the occupation began in 1967. And so from 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel to 1967, Israel really struggling for its right to exist, to be acknowledged. And the Arab community is having its struggles along the way as well, because from the Arab perspective, 1948 was a grave injustice. From the Nakba, 1967, similarly, was a struggle for the Arab community. In large part, the goals at that time was certainly to eradicate the State of Israel, but increasingly the struggle for the Palestinian people became a struggle for liberation, and a struggle for liberation or a shaking off of the occupation. So the Arabic word for shaking off is intifada. And the intifada, the first intifada happened in the 1980s. In large part, it was nonviolent. It was not only nonviolent, but there were a number of creative acts of resistance that were taken during the first intifada. And you'll see soon that the second intifada was much, much more violent. So what came out of the first intifada, in large part, the acts of resistance and led to what ultimately became the Oslo Accords, to a peace process in the early 1990s. And the Oslo Accords were a time of great hope, a time where it was believed that peace was possible, that there would be a two-state solution. And I won't go into the details, but the short answer to the issue of the Oslo Accords is that it didn't work, that there was this idea of state building, and that the people, the Arab people and the Jewish people, would be separated so that they could become independent states. But ultimately, it led to increased separation, that the 20% of the Israeli population who are Palestinian started to experience increasingly to experience being treated like second-class citizens, and you had more of a separation between the people rather than a true peace. And so the Oslo Accords, while they were a time of great hope, ultimately failed. So this goes through a little bit of some of the pictures of the Oslo Accords. I wanted you to be able to see these maps. You know, we're talking about the world, we're talking about justice in the midst of this lunch hour. And here you can see this map on the, I don't know if it's on your left, it's on my left, the map with the green segments in the middle. And you can see the white area is Israel proper. The little orange area in the bottom of the screen is Gaza. The area that is inside the black with the green chunks, that is the West Bank. And so when we talk about the occupation, when we talk about the occupied Palestinian territories, we're talking about East Jerusalem, which you can see identified in that map as Al-Quds, the Jewish word for Jerusalem. And you can see the different areas and the segmentation within the West Bank. And the areas, that area C is not identified there, but increasingly from 1967, one of the main problems we started to see in the West Bank was the building of Israeli settlements, Israeli cities and Israeli communities in the West Bank that are for Jewish population centers. Settlements in the West Bank are often much more affordable, but there are ideological settlers, Jews who are living in the Palestinian territory because they believe that it was given to them by God. And so you have ideological settlers and you have economic settlers. And the settlement population today is more than 500,000 Jews who are living on the Palestinian side of the separation barrier. So the Oslo Accords, as I mentioned, was really about separating so that there could become a two-state solution, which didn't work. And as it didn't work, violence continued to escalate, culminating in the early 2000s during what was known as the Second Intifada. One of the starting points, certainly from the perspective of the Palestinian people, was that the Israeli general, Ariel Sharon, visited the Temple Mount. We started our conversation about how that's a sacred site in Islam. One of the mechanisms that was employed by the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian government, and the Palestinian resistance was that of suicide bombs. And there were horrific bombings all over Israel that targeted civilians, even children. And many, many Israeli civilians were killed. And Israel's government response, Israel's military response was disproportionate. And so you saw brutal attacks where similarly thousands of Palestinian civilians were injured and or killed as well. And so the Second Intifada, in large part, I mean, this is very, very recent history, marked this culmination of violence where the attempts towards peace just weren't being successful. And so in that, I wanted to just take a picture to show you some of the maps of some of the history that we've been talking about. So the map that you see on the left there, the occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank. Area C makes up 60% of the West Bank and is completely under Israeli control. And so one of the concerns today with this whole idea of the two-state solution is that many people are saying, what land is left for Palestinians to be able to establish a state? And so you see the map on the right-hand side of the dark green, where in 1946, you have historic Palestine, you have some of the communities of indigenous Jewish communities that had been there for hundreds and thousands of years. And then you can see as Jewish immigration increased, and then certainly what was proposed in the UN partition plan, the white representing Jewish land, the dark green representing Palestinian land. After 1967, when the Israeli military was so successful, you can see that the territory designated for a future Palestinian state decreased. And then this map from 2010 shows you the areas that are currently Gaza and areas that are called Areas A in the West Bank that are under Palestinian control. And so many people say the Palestinian territories look like Swiss cheese. There is no way for there to be a contiguous state where Palestinians will be able to travel freely, have freedom of movement, have access to borders. And so in many ways, the geopolitical situation does not look hopeful. So what does that mean for us today in terms of realities on the ground? And we return to this beautiful picture of the Temple Mount. This is from a different vantage point. In front here, you see the Western Wall, the sacred most site in Israel for the Jewish people. So what's happening in the 21st century on the ground in Jerusalem and in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories? One of the consequences, it started to be built during the Second Intifada, was the separation barrier. In the cities, as is seen here, the separation barrier is twice as tall, and the length of it is 3 times as long as the Berlin Wall. The separation barrier was meant to separate the Palestinian territories from Israel proper. However, the placement of the barrier and where it was built was that it was built in large part on Palestinian land. So this wall, according to international law, is considered illegal because, not that it exists, but because of where it's built. So in many of the communities, the separation wall is built where there are Palestinian communities on one side and Palestinian communities on the other. The wall is built where it cuts off farmers from access to be able to tend to their orchards, where family members aren't given access to school, or where they have to go through checkpoints to be able to go to work or to be able to go to school. And so the separation barrier is one of the major challenges today, particularly for the Palestinian communities that live along the border. We talked a bit about the settlements. This is a picture of a Jewish settlement in the West Bank. They often have private police forces. You can see that there's a wall built around it. They are rapidly, rapidly growing. They began after 1967. Citizens of Israel who live in settlements are protected by civil law, whereas Palestinians who are living in the West Bank live under military law. And so settlements are one of the things you'll be hearing about under the Biden administration. We heard about them certainly under the Obama administration, and the President Trump and his team were very favorable of the settlements. In fact, the US ambassador to Israel had strong ties to the settlement movement and was very supportive of the belief that the West Bank should be annexed to become a part of Israel. There's other humanitarian concerns. This is a picture of Gaza. Gaza, we'll talk about a little bit more, but there are often forced displacements and home demolitions, and Palestinians, as I mentioned, aren't protected by civil law because they're under military law. And so many of their realities are the realities of a people living under occupation. One of the issues that we work on at Churches for Middle East Peace is the issue of children who are being detained by the Israeli military. Many children who are arrested for having thrown stones. The conviction ratio of children who are arrested is more than 99%. Many of them, more than 60%, are arrested in the middle of the night. The Israeli military goes into the children's home. Children or any youth under the age of 18, and the children are often taken away from their family, taken to a police station, which are in neighboring settlements. And so Betty McCollum, Congressman Betty McCollum, has actually been proposing legislation in Congress to address child detentions, and specifically to address US forces training Israeli military to use tactics that often can be used in mechanisms of the occupation, like child detentions. Collective punishment is also a current reality of the occupation. If a family member is convicted of an act of terrorism, often the family home will be demolished, for example. Water is used as a mechanism to control the Palestinian people. The water resources are controlled by Israel. And so there are times in Bethlehem where, depending on what's happening in the political situation between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government, literally the water will be turned off. And so when you're in Jerusalem, when you have Jewish homes and Arab homes, you can tell which homes in large part belong to Palestinians because they have black water tanks on their roof where they, when the water is turned on, they fill up the black water tanks so that they can have access to water. And there are statistics about the water usage that are certainly worth being aware of. You know, the World Health Organization says a person should have access to about 100 liters of water per day for showers and for drinking and for washing vegetables, for cooking, for anything that we might need. The average Israeli uses about as much water as the average American, more than 300 liters of water per day. And the average Palestinian has less than 100 liters of water per day. And Bedouins that are living in the communities in the desert often are living on only 30 liters of water per day. We talked a bit about the demolition of Palestinian homes being one of the mechanisms of the occupation. We talked a bit about forced displacement from 1948 to 1967. It's important to acknowledge that after the Six-Day War, Jewish communities that were in Arab states were also displaced. And so you've had displacement of different communities as a part of the historic conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. I wish that we had more time together to be able to talk about Gaza. Gaza is one of the greatest humanitarian crises in the world today. Yemen is certainly the greatest, but Gaza has been identified as de-developing. The vast majority of water in Gaza is not potable. And Gaza right now is completely closed, where you have, you can't enter or leave Gaza by water, and then there is a border. You can see the Erez crossing between Gaza and Israel, the Rafah crossing between Gaza and Egypt, and those crossings at different points are open or closed. There have been 3 major wars in an 8-year period between 2008, 2012, and 2014 being the most recent. And so the realities affecting the communities in Gaza, lack of access to humanitarian support, Gaza being under the control of Hamas, which is deemed a terrorist organization by the United States government. It's important to understand Hamas has a political wing, which in large part is a bureaucratic political mechanism, and it has a military wing. But Hamas at different points has said that it would be willing to acknowledge Israel's right to exist, and Hamas often acts as a mediating factor of more extreme forces that are also present in Gaza. There are rockets that at various points in history have been fired from Gaza into Israel. In large part, the technology is not very good, so there certainly is trauma imposed upon the Jewish communities. There have been deaths on occasion. The majority of time, the rockets will cause damage to crops or damage to buildings and property, but they, in large part, are not very sophisticated in terms of weapons, which is one of Israel's arguments to why Gaza should be closed, so that weapons could not be brought into Gaza. And Churches for Middle East Peace were advocating for humanitarian access to be brought to these communities, one of the most populated areas of the earth, with more than 2 million people living there. So that is a snapshot of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm exhausted. I hope you all stayed with me. And the reason I wanted to share this with you, I know this is a lunch hour conversation, and so I hope that I didn't go too deeply into the details. But what I wanted to share with you is this: that I believe God has called all of us. You know, we started with that verse from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the ends of the earth. That God has called all of us who've chosen to follow Jesus to be agents of his gospel in the world, wherever that may be. And it may not be where you expect. It may not be, you know, for me, I expected it to be in China. For me, I thought that I would do domestic social justice work, which I still do a bit, but I certainly didn't anticipate that God would call me to the Middle East. And so my hope and prayer for each of you is that as you seek to discern God's call on your life, that you would pay attention to the promptings. At World Vision, we used to say the prayer of our founder: may God break our hearts for the things that break the heart of God. And so my prayer is today that you will have been exposed to some of the realities that affect the Jewish people of Israel, certainly the Palestinian people living in Israel proper, but also living in the Palestinian territories. And that as we engage in issues around the world, be it in Israel and in Palestine, be it in Washington, D.C., in response to the recent January 6 actions, the actions of Christian nationalism that many people actually did in the name of Jesus. My hope and prayer from Washington, D.C. to Jerusalem is that we would be people who seek to follow God, to love our neighbor, to not only love our neighbor, to love our enemy, and that we would seek to be advocates of justice, human rights, and equality for all people, Israeli, Palestinian, from the United States, or from anywhere in the world. So I'm looking forward to our conversation and to being together.